The wagon did not stop. Josiah Calloway reached back through the canvas flap with one hand, grabbed his eldest daughter by the collar of her coat and threw her off the tailgate into the dust of the Bozeman Trail like she was a sack of spoiled flour. The wagon kept rolling, the mules kept pulling, the wheels kept turning in that slow grinding rhythm that had been the only music for 1,100 miles. A blanket landed into the dirt beside her, not thrown by Josiah, thrown by someone smaller, someone quicker, someone whose arm darted out from behind the canvases and disappeared again before anyone could see. Then the flap closed. The wagon moved on, and 16-year-old Emma Calloway sat in the middle of the road in Montana Territory watching her family shrink against the shoulders of the Absaroka Range until they were a speck and then nothing at all. It was November 14th, 1883. The Northern Pacific Railroad had finished its line through Montana just that summer, putting the territory to a fresh wave of homesteaders, pushing west with land claims and ambitions, in the particular kind of optimism that only people who have never wintered in the Northern Rockies can sustain. Bozeman, 43 miles to the northeast, was already a real town now. Post office, general store, telegraph office, train depot, where you could buy a ticket east if you had money and a reason. But 43 miles from the nearest depot, civilization stopped like a sentence cut short. Out here, it was still the old law. Live or die depending on your head and your hands and nothing else. The temperature was 15 degrees and dropping. The sun had already gone behind the western ridgeline, and the shadows were filling the valley floor like dark water rising. In another 2 hours, it would be full dark. In another 6 hours, it would be below 10 degrees. Most people who found themselves alone and unequipped in this country in November did not last 72 hours. The statistics kept by the Territorial Army garrison at Fort Ellis were specific on this point. Exposure killed faster than starvation, faster than thirst, faster than anything except a bullet. And exposure started the moment you stopped moving and did not have shelter. Emma did not cry. She did not scream after the wagon or curse her father or make any of the sounds you might expect from a girl who had just been thrown away like damaged cargo by the man who was supposed to protect her. She sat in the dust and she breathed and she watched the wagon disappear, and she processed what had happened with the cold clarity that had been the thing about her that frightened Josiah most, though he never would have admitted that fear was what he felt. He would have called it something else: defiance, disobedience. The look in her eyes that reminded him too much of her mother. She knew why he had done it. Josiah Calloway was a third-generation Pennsylvania farmer from a family that believed in God, silence, obedience, and the natural order of things, which placed women somewhere between the livestock and the furniture in terms of their authority to speak, think, or act independently. He was not a monster in the way that word is usually meant. He did not drink. He did not beat his children without what he considered cause. He worked hard and he provided, and he believed absolutely that the world functioned correctly only when every person in it stayed in their designated place. He had married a Shawnee woman from Ohio in what was either a moment of rebellion against his own rigid upbringing or a moment of weakness he spent the rest of his life trying to correct. Her name was never spoken in the Calloway household after she died. Emma's mother, a woman whose eyes saw everything and whose mind processed what her eyes saw with a speed and precision that made her husband uncomfortable in ways he could never articulate. She read, she asked questions, she looked at the world as if she had every right to understand it. These qualities which another man might have valued, Josiah Calloway experienced as threats. When she died in 1875, fever 3 days, no doctor, because Josiah considered illness God's jurisdiction and not his own. Josiah erased her, banned the Shawnee language, forbade any mention of her heritage, burned the 2 books she had owned, and above all else banned reading for his daughters because his wife had been a reader, and Josiah blamed her education for making her difficult. Educated women brought nothing but trouble to a homestead. That was the lesson he drew from his marriage, and he enforced it with the absolute conviction of a man who has confused his own discomfort with divine truth. Emma broke the only rule that mattered. She taught her younger sisters to read, not from a novel or a newspaper or anything that could be construed as worldly corruption, from Josiah's own Bible, the King James Version that sat on the wagon seat beside him like a second passenger. Her youngest sister, 7 years old, had pointed at a word on one of the pages Emma was turning and asked, "What does that say?" She asked it with eyes that were exactly her mother's eyes, dark and wide and hungry for an answer. And Emma could not say no to those eyes. Could not say, I am not allowed to tell you what that word means. Could not say, your father believes knowing things will ruin you the way it ruined your mother. She taught them. For 3 weeks in whispered sessions behind the wagon, when Josiah was riding ahead or trading at a way station, she taught her sisters to sound out letters and connect them into words and connect words into meaning. The youngest could read her own name by the time Josiah caught them. He caught them on November 13th, said nothing, did not hit anyone, went to bed. The next morning he threw Emma off the wagon. The message was not complicated. Know your place or have no place at all. Emma picked up the blanket and examined it, shook out the dust, turned it over. That was when she found the ribbon. A small blue hair ribbon tied carefully to one corner of the wool in a knot that was tight but uneven, the work of small fingers operating in haste and secrecy. Her youngest sister had tied her own ribbon to the blanket and thrown it out before the canvas closed. A 7-year-old's act of love performed at risk of punishment, smuggled past a father who would have beaten her for it. Emma untied the ribbon and wrapped it twice around her left wrist, pulling the knot tight with her teeth. She would wear it there through everything that came next, through cold that should have killed her and work that nearly did, through the construction of something that would outlast every person she had ever known. Through 6 decades of Montana winters, the ribbon would stay. She stood up, not dramatically, not with her jaw set against the sky in some kind of dramatic declaration of survival. She stood up because sitting in the road meant dying in the road, and whatever else Emma Calloway was or would become, she was not a person who would die sitting down. She looked at what she had. The clothes on her back, which amounted to a cotton dress, a thin wool coat with one button missing, and leather shoes worn nearly through at the soles. One wool blanket now dusty, one blue ribbon now tied to her wrist. No knife, no rope, no flint or matches, no food, nothing. She looked at where she was. The Bozeman Trail ran through a valley here maybe half a mile wide, with lodgepole pine climbing the western slopes in dense green ranks and a creek cutting through a stand of cottonwood trees roughly 200 yards to the north. The valley ran roughly east to west, which meant the southern slopes caught full winter sun, while the northern slopes stayed in shadow most of the day. The creek was audible even from here, which meant it was still running, which meant it was spring fed from higher up and had not frozen yet despite the temperature. These were not random observations. These were assessments made by a mind trained to read landscape the way a scholar reads text. Emma's mother had given her that training not through lectures or lessons, but through 8 years of daily life in which every action was a teaching moment and every moment in nature was an opportunity to see instead of merely look. The difference between looking and seeing was the most important thing her mother ever taught her. Anyone could look at a stand of lodgepole pine. Her mother taught her to see that the dead standing trees were dry fuel ready to burn without seasoning. Anyone could look at a creek. Her mother taught her to see that the place where the water ran dark and slow was a pool deep enough to hold fish, and that the direction of flow told you which way was downhill and where the water came from. Anyone could look at a hillside. Her mother taught her to see that the south-facing slope with the cut bank at its base was a wall already built, an excavation already made a shelter, waiting for someone smart enough to recognize it. Her mother had been practical, the way stone is hard. Not because she chose practicality, but because it was her nature ground into her by ancestry, an experience in a life that had no time for panic or self-pity, or the assumption that the world owed you anything at all. She was Shawnee. Her people had survived in these landscapes for thousands of years before anyone from Europe arrived to explain to them that survival was difficult. The knowledge was in her blood and her hands, in the way she moved through the world without wasting a single motion on anything that did not serve the immediate goal of continuing to exist. She died when Emma was 8. 3 days of fever. No doctor. Josiah would not ride for one. The last thing she said to her daughter, holding Emma's hand, with fingers that had already gone thin and hot, was, "Remember what I taught you. Do not let anyone tell you that you are not good enough to live." Emma remembered. She remembered everything. And now, standing on a dirt road in Montana territory with the temperature dropping and the light failing, and nothing between her and death, except the contents of her own mind, she put that memory to work. She started walking toward the tree line. Not running, walking. Moving with the kind of deliberate energy conserving, pace that her mother would have used because every calorie burned unnecessarily was a calorie she could not afford to spend. She had no food, no way to get food until she had fire, and no way to get fire until she found the means. Every physical effort had to count. The creek was cold and clear, running over smooth stones, with a sound that in any other circumstance might have been pleasant. Emma knelt and drank until her stomach ached, then stood and began surveying the immediate area with systematic attention. Not wandering, surveying, working north from the creek in a sweep pattern, breaking small branches to mark significant finds, building a mental map of resources within a half-mile radius. Deadfall branches for immediate fuel. A game trail heading northwest with fresh elk droppings no more than a day old. A sandstone outcrop where the rock fractured into flat pieces when she pried at the seams with a stick, pieces that could serve as crude tools or building material. Cottonwood bark that could be shredded into tinder. Rose hip bushes with dried fruit still clinging to the branches, bitter and nearly worthless nutritionally but technically edible. A cut bank 30 yards downstream from where she first reached the creek, a place where spring floods had undercut the bank to create a shallow overhang, maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with a dirt floor and a natural roof that would shed light snow and block the worst of the north wind. She had no food and no fire, but she had a map in her head, and every item on that map was a problem solved or a resource identified, and her mother's voice in her memory said what it always said. Survival is just a series of small problems solved in the right order. Problem 1, stay alive tonight. Problem 2, figure out tomorrow. That first night nearly killed her. She wedged herself into the cut bank piled deadfall branches across the opening to create a windbreak, pulled the blanket over her head, and endured. There is no other word for it. Endured. The temperature dropped to 9 degrees by her best estimate, based on the way the cold felt against her skin and the rate at which her extremities went numb. Cold enough that her fingers lost sensation within minutes, even when tucked under her arms. Cold enough that her body shook so violently and so continuously that her teeth cracked against each other in a rhythm she could not control, a sound like someone tapping a chisel against stone, steady and relentless and coming from inside her own skull. Cold enough that her thoughts began to blur at the edges. The first whisper of hypothermia, the body's systems beginning to shut down in sequence, sacrificing the periphery to protect the core, pulling blood away from fingers and toes and the surface of the skin, and concentrating it around the heart and lungs and brain, buying time and minutes at the cost of tissue that would take weeks to heal if it healed at all. She did not sleep, could not sleep. Instead, she counted. It was the only thing she could do that required enough mental focus to keep her conscious, or without requiring physical effort she could not afford. She counted to 1,000, then started over. Counted the meals she had helped her mother prepare. At least 4,000, counted the wagon wheels she had watched repaired on the trail, memorizing the process each time. 17. Counted the times she had watched the blacksmith forge weld broken hardware and noted the temperature of the metal by its color. 8. Counted the number of times her father had told her she would never amount to anything. She stopped counting that one. When dawn came gray and bitter, and without warmth, she crawled out of the cut bank on hands and knees and stood in the pale light and understood the first and most important lesson the Montana winter had to teach. Shelter without heat was just dying slower. The second day she continued her survey of the area, extending her range to a full mile in every direction, moving with purpose despite the hunger that was already becoming a physical presence in her body, a hollow ache behind her ribs that pulled at her attention, the way a toothache pulls constantly, distractingly, a reminder that the clock was running, and the clock did not care about her plans. The second night was worse than the first, 6 degrees. She added more branches to the windbreak, curled tighter in the blanket, and thought about Otto Breitman. Otto Breitman was 60 years old, a stonemason from Bavaria, who had joined the wagon train in Independence, Missouri, bound for the goldfields around Virginia City. He was short, thick through the chest, with a white beard stained yellow around his mouth from decades of pipe smoking, and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same stone he spent his life shaping. His eyes were blue, and they lit up when he talked about masonry, the way other men's eyes lit up when they talked about gold or women or God, with the absolute conviction of a true believer who has found his faith and cannot understand why the rest of the world has not found it too. His faith was the Kachelöfen. Every evening around the campfire, while the other men drank whiskey and talked about land claims and gold veins and the various ways they intended to become rich. Otto tried to explain something that none of them wanted to hear. The problem with every fireplace in America, he said, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick, while his audience ignored him, was simple and devastating. 80% of the heat went straight up the chimney. You built a fire, the fire heated the air. The hot air rose because hot air rises and it went up the chimney and out into the sky. You were not heating your house, you were heating the atmosphere, it was Otto said in his heavy German accent. Stupid. He apologized for the word, but did not retract it. In Germany, in Russia, in Scandinavia, in every cold country where people had been building with stone for centuries, they had solved this problem long ago. The solution was called a Kachelofen, a masonry heater, and the principle behind it was so simple that Otto could not understand why Americans refused to adopt it. Instead of building an open fireplace with a straight chimney that allowed smoke and heat to escape directly upward, you built a closed firebox surrounded by massive amounts of stone. Then you routed the smoke from the firebox through long, winding channels inside the stone structure before allowing it to exit through the chimney. The smoke traveled 15, maybe 20 feet through all that masonry before it reached the outside air. And the entire time it was traveling through those channels, it was in contact with cold stone, and heat was transferring from the hot smoke into the cold stone continuously, inevitably, because that is what heat does. It moves from hot to cold. You cannot stop it. You can only direct it. By the time the smoke finally exited the chimney, it had surrendered most of its heat to the stone. And the stone, having absorbed all that thermal energy, would radiate it back into the room slowly, steadily, for 18 hours or more after the fire died. A conventional fireplace kept maybe 18 or 20% of the heat from the fire it burned. A properly built Kachelofen kept 70%. That was the difference between burning through a cord of wood every week and burning through a cord every month. It was the difference in a Montana winter between living and dying. The men around the campfire laughed. One of them, a former teamster named Sullivan, said the old man needed more whiskey and less talking. Another said you could not build a working chimney out of creekstone because creekstone cracked in heat. A third said the whole idea sounded like German superstition and he would stick with a good American fireplace, thank you very much. Otto muttered something in German that was probably not a compliment and walked away from the fire to sit by himself near the wagon tongue he was repairing. Emma had been sitting at the edge of the firelight, the place where daughters sat when their fathers believed that daughters should be seen as little as possible and heard not at all. She heard everything Otto said. She understood perhaps half of it, but she remembered all of it because that was the gift her mother had given her, the ability to take in information and store it with perfect fidelity, even when she did not yet understand what it meant. A week later, she found a reason to walk past where Otto was working, and she asked him questions. He was astonished. In 5 months on the trail, no one had ever asked him a follow-up question about the Kachelofen. No one had ever asked him any question about it at all, unless you counted Sullivan asking him to shut up. He explained more. The ratio of stone mass to room volume, which determined how much heat the structure could store and how long it would radiate. Too little mass and the stone cooled too fast. Too much mass and it took too long to heat up. The channels had to be long enough to extract maximum heat from the smoke, but not so narrow or so convoluted that they choked the draft. A Kachelofen needed airflow to function, needed the smoke to keep moving through the channels, and if the channels were too tight, the fire would suffocate or the smoke would back up into the room. The damper was critical, a flat stone or metal plate that could be slid into position to seal the chimney system after the fire died. With the damper open, hot air and smoke flowed through the channels and out. With the damper closed, the system was sealed. No heat could escape upward through the chimney. No cold air could pull backward into the room. The stone mass became a closed thermal battery, radiating its stored heat into the living space, at a rate determined by physics and nothing else. Emma asked if you could build one using creekstone instead of manufactured fire brick. Otto considered this seriously, which was itself a form of respect. Ja, he said, you could. The creekstone would work for the channels in the outer structure. But the firebox, the part where the actual fire burned, would be a problem. Sandstone and river rock were not designed to withstand the thermal shock of direct flame. They would crack. Maybe after one winter, maybe two. Then you would need to replace the firebox stones with fresh ones and remortar them. Emma nodded, filed it away. Every word, every principle, every ratio and relationship. Otto turned west in the Yellowstone Fork, heading for Virginia City with a small party of miners. Emma never saw him again. He never knew that his obsession, the thing that every single person on the wagon train dismissed as the ramblings of a crazy old German who could not stop talking about chimneys, would save a life that winter. And then another, and then dozens more. There is a certain kind of person who says the right thing at the right time but says it to the wrong audience. Otto Breitman was that person. He said exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. He just said it to people who did not want to hear it, except one. On the third morning, Emma got lucky. She found a dead rabbit in the underbrush near the creek. A hawk had killed it but been spooked off by something before it could feed. The rabbit was fresh, still flexible, unmarked except for the talon wounds on its back. She washed it in the creek, tore it apart with her hands, and ate it raw, forcing herself to chew slowly and thoroughly the way her mother had taught her when eating dry jerky on the trail. Slow chewing meant better digestion. Better digestion meant more nutrition extracted. When you were starving, every calorie counted. It was not enough to stop the hunger, but it was enough to stop the shaking in her hands and the blurring at the edges of her thoughts. With protein in her system, she could think clearly again. And the thinking she did was cold and precise and entirely without self-pity. The wagon trains were done for the season. Nobody would come through the Bozeman Trail until April at the earliest. Bozeman was 43 miles northeast, too far to reach on foot without gear or food in temperatures that would kill her the first night she had to sleep without shelter. That left exactly one option: winter here or die trying. She needed four things in order: fire, shelter, a food supply, and heat. Not warmth, which was temporary and unreliable. Heat, stored heat, radiant heat. The kind of heat that would keep a person alive when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The kind of heat that Otto Breitman had been trying to teach the world about while the world laughed. Fire first. She spent 2 days searching for flint, checking every rock outcrop within a mile of her camp. Found plenty of sandstone, some granite, even a vein of quartz that flashed in the thin November sun. No flint. She tried the bow drill method of friction fire, starting a technique she had seen demonstrated in Pennsylvania before the family left. Could not make it work. Her fingers were too cold, too clumsy. The wood was wrong, or her technique was wrong, or both. She tried striking stones together in every combination she could think of, smashing quartz against granite, sandstone against quartz, anything that might produce a spark. Her hands bled. Nothing caught. On the fifth day, she found salvation in the dirt beside the trail. A broken bottle. Half buried, crusted with soil, the glass curved and thick in a way that suggested it had once held patent medicine or cheap whiskey. Someone had thrown it from a wagon months or years ago, and it had lain there in the Montana dirt, waiting for the one person who would understand what it was. Curved glass. A natural magnifying lens. She spent 3 hours on her knees in a patch of November sunlight, holding the glass at precisely the right angle to focus a point of concentrated light onto a tinder bundle of shredded cottonwood bark and dry grass. The sun was weak this late in the season, low on the horizon, filtered through thin cloud. The focal point was barely visible, a hot spot no bigger than a pencil point wavering every time her hands trembled from cold or exhaustion. She blew on the tinder so gently that her head went light and the edges of her vision darkened from the effort of controlled, sustained exhalation. When the first coal appeared glowing orange in the shredded bark like a tiny heartbeat, she fed it, added grass, added bark fibers. Blew again, softer, steadier, coaxing the coal the way you coax a frightened animal with patience and the understanding that any sudden movement would destroy what you were trying to create. The flame caught, small, fragile, barely alive. She fed it twigs, then sticks, then branches, building it with the care of someone constructing the most important thing she had ever built, because at that moment it was. A broken bottle thrown away by a stranger saved the life of a girl thrown away by her father. The frontier was full of that kind of symmetry if you knew where to look. With fire, she could cook, could warm herself, could begin to think about the next problem instead of merely surviving the current one. She maintained the fire continuously from that point forward, banking it at night under a mound of ash and coals, feeding it back to life each morning, never letting it die completely, because she had no guarantee she could start another. Now she could think about shelter. The cut bank was temporary, exposed wrong in every way that mattered. She needed walls, a roof, a chimney, and not just any chimney. She spent a week scouting the valley in every direction, evaluating potential building sites with the systematic attention of someone who understood that the difference between a good location and a bad one could be the difference between surviving winter and becoming another set of bones that the spring thaw would reveal. She found her site a quarter-mile upstream where the valley narrowed and the hillside on the north offered something she recognized immediately as extraordinary. A natural alcove cut into the slope by centuries of erosion and freeze-thaw cycling, roughly 12 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with solid compacted earth on three sides, in a southern exposure that would catch the winter sun from early morning until mid-afternoon. Three walls already built, not by human hands but by geology, by the patient, relentless work of water and ice and time that had carved this niche into the hillside and left it waiting for someone who could see what it was. She would build a front wall across the 15-foot opening, install a door, and she would have an earth-sheltered cabin that would stay warmer than any freestanding log structure in the territory because the earth on three sides would moderate temperature swings, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night, buffering the interior against the wild fluctuations of the Montana climate. But more than that, the thermal mass of the hillside itself would work in concert with the cachalofins she intended to build. The earth would hold temperature. The stone chimney would radiate temperature. Together, they would create a passive heating system that required a fraction of the fuel any conventional cabin consumed. This was not guesswork. This was the application of principles she had learned from Otto Breitman and observations she had made on her own, synthesized in the mind of a 16-year-old girl during nights of shivering calculation in a cut bank, where the temperature was 6 degrees and the only thing between her and death was her ability to think. November 26, 1883. She estimated she had perhaps 3 weeks before the heavy snow started. 3 weeks to see if a 16-year-old girl with one axe head, a broken saw blade, and no formal training of any kind could build a structure that would keep her alive through one of the most severe winters in Montana territorial history. She started with the foundation, cleared the alcove of loose rock and debris, hauling each stone out by hand and sorting them as she went, the flat ones in one pile for building, the round ones in another for fill the broken, irregular ones for drainage work she already knew she would need. She leveled the floor by scraping and packing with flat stones, getting down on her hands and knees to check the grade by placing a round pebble on the surface and watching which way it rolled. If it rolled toward the back wall, the grade was wrong. Water would pool. She needed the floor to slope imperceptibly toward the front opening so that any moisture that got in would drain out instead of collecting. Then the foundation trench. Across the entire 15-foot opening, going down 3 feet until she hit bedrock. She used a sharpened flat stone as a shovel, chipping at the frozen earth in strokes that produced maybe a tablespoon of dirt per swing. When the flat stone hit rock too hard to chip, she switched to a pointed stone and pecked at it the way a woodpecker pecks at bark, patient, rhythmic, relentless. Her bare hands did everything the stones could not reach, scooping loose dirt, fitting rocks into place, pressing clay mortar into joints with her fingers. The trench took 4 days. 4 days of kneeling in frozen dirt for 12 hours at a time, digging a hole 3 feet deep and 15 feet long with tools made from other rocks. At the end of each day, she could barely stand. Her knees were bruised black, her lower back seized when she straightened. Her shoulders burned from the repetitive overhead lifting of stones into the growing wall. Her hands blistered on the first day, bled on the second. The blisters broke, and the raw skin underneath was exposed to dirt and clay and cold water from the creek where she mixed mortar, and it hurt in a way that was constant and inescapable. A burning soreness that lived in her palms and fingers and wrists and did not stop when she stopped working because the cold kept the wounds open and the work kept them growing. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her dress at night and unwrapped them each morning to find the fabric stuck to the wounds with dried blood, requiring a slow, painful peeling that she learned to do without wincing because wincing did not help and the day was not going to wait. By the 5th day, the blisters had become calluses, thick and hard and yellow, and the calluses were the hands she would wear for the rest of her life. They were not pretty hands. They were never going to be pretty hands again. But they could grip a 40-pound stone and hold it steady while she checked the fit against the course below, and that was what mattered. She worked 12 hours a day, sunrise to sunset, stopping only when the light failed and she could no longer see to fit stones. The routine became mechanical, which was its own form of salvation. Wake in the dark, build up the fire from banked coals, eat whatever she had, which was usually nothing or close to it, walk to the site, work until her hands were too cold to feel the stones, then warm them over the fire until the feeling came back, which hurt worse than the cold had, because returning sensation always does. Work again, eat at midday if there was anything to eat, work until dark, walk back to the fire, sleep, repeat. Food was whatever she could find or catch. A grouse she managed to brain with a thrown rock after 3 misses, the first 2 misses costing her energy she could not afford, and the third throw guided by something that was not quite skill and not quite luck, but something in between, a desperate focus that made her arm do exactly what it needed to do, because failure was not a concept her body could afford to entertain. Rose hips stripped from bushes along the creek, bitter enough to make her mouth pucker, but containing just enough sugar and vitamin C to keep scurvy at bay. An elk carcass left by wolves who had eaten their fill and moved on the meat half frozen and rank with the smell of predator saliva. But protein was protein, and she cut what she could with sharp stones and carried it back to her fire and cooked it until it was charred on the outside and warm enough on the inside to chew. That elk carcass gave her 5 days of meat before what remained turned green and soft, and she had to drag it downstream and leave it for whatever scavengers wanted it. 5 days of having enough energy to work at full capacity instead of the half speed that hunger enforced. She used those 5 days the way a general uses a temporary advantage, pushing hard, building fast, getting as much done as possible before the fuel ran out and the slow grinding insufficiency resumed. She was losing weight she did not have to lose, could feel her hip bones becoming prominent beneath her dress, her collarbones sharpening under her coat, the muscles in her arms becoming corded and visible in a way they never had been before, burning fat and then burning themselves because there was not enough fuel coming in to sustain the output she was demanding. She knew in the abstract that a body could consume itself for weeks before it stopped functioning. She knew in the specific that she was on a clock, and the clock was her own metabolism, and every day she did not eat enough was a day the clock ran a little faster. But the work kept her warm during the day, and the purpose kept her sane. She was building something. For the first time in her life, she was building something that belonged to her, that no one could take away by forbidding it or throwing her out of a wagon, something that would stand or fall based entirely on whether she had gotten the engineering right. There was a power in that ownership that went beyond shelter or survival. It was the power of making something real, something that existed in the physical world because she had decided it should exist and then done the work to make it so. Her father could forbid her to read. He could not forbid a stone wall to stand. By December 3rd, she had the foundation trench filled with fitted stones, tight-jointed and solid, and she was ready to begin the wall framing. That was the day Gunnar Harstead found her. He rode up on a mule in the early afternoon, a man in his late 50s, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind and cold into something that looked less like skin than like the bark of an old pine, furrowed and tough, and permanently set in an expression that gave away nothing. He had broad hands and narrow eyes and a way of sitting on his mule that suggested he had been doing it so long, the mule had become an extension of his body rather than a separate animal. He was Norwegian by birth, had come to Montana 3 years earlier with the intention of farming and the understanding that farming in this climate was less about growing things than about not dying while you tried. He had established a homestead 7 miles north along the same creek, built a cabin, survived 3 winters, and buried 3 neighbors in that time. 2 families who froze to death their first January when their firewood ran out during a cold snap that dropped to 40 below. 1 man who burned alive in February when his overheated stovepipe ignited the roof beams of his cabin. 3 deaths, 3 graves dug in frozen ground with a pickaxe while the rest of the valley stood around looking at the sky and wondering whose turn was next. Gunnar Harstead carried those graves with him, the way a man carries a wound that healed wrong, always there, always aching, always reminding him that he had arrived too late 3 times and might arrive too late again. He sat on his mule and watched Emma wrestle a 40-pound sandstone block into position in the foundation wall, adjusting its placement by fractions of an inch, testing the fit with her fingers before he spoke. "You are that girl. The one got thrown from the Callaway wagon." Word traveled in sparsely settled country, not through newspapers, but through the quiet network of riders and way stations and chance encounters that served as the frontier's communication system. Someone had seen, someone had told someone. Gunnar knew. Emma straightened up, wiped her hands on her skirt, leaving smears of clay and blood on the fabric. Yes, sir. Gunnar dismounted. He walked to the foundation trench and knelt, which was not a casual act for a man his age with knees that had spent 50 years absorbing the impact of hard ground and heavy labor. He ran his hand along the stonework, pressed the joints, tested the fit of one stone against the next with the practiced touch of a man who had built with stone himself and knew what good work felt like. He stood, brushed off his knees, looked at Emma with an expression that she had not seen directed at her by an adult in a very long time. He was not laughing. Good fitting, he said. Tight joints. Where did you learn this? Watched a mason on our wagon train. German fellow named Otto Breitman. Gunnar's eyebrows went up. Crazy Otto, the one who would not stop talking about his Russian stove. Emma allowed herself a small smile. The first since November 14th. That is the one, except I do not think he was crazy. Gunnar looked at the alcove, the cleared floor, the foundation, the stockpile of gathered stone, the girl who had gathered it. You are planning to winter here in this. I am planning to build here. Got about 2 weeks before the heavy snow. Figure that is enough. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed in the way that men sigh when they have decided something they are not entirely comfortable with, but cannot see another option. I have got an old axe head back at my place. No handle, but you could make one. Got a broken saw, too. Maybe 12 inches of blade left. And I suppose I could spare a few pounds of salt pork if you were going to starve out here otherwise. Something cracked in Emma's chest, some wall she had built around the part of herself that was still capable of being affected by kindness. She kept her voice steady. I would be obliged, sir. I will pay you back come spring. Gunnar waved that off. Just do not die, girl. I have got enough ghosts on this creek. I do not need yours. He mounted his mule and rode north without looking back. Emma stood watching him go and understood that what he had given her was not an axe head or a broken saw or a few pounds of preserved meat. What he had given her was the first evidence since her mother died that another human being believed she was capable of doing what she intended to do. The axe changed everything. She carved a handle from green ash, splitting a branch with her stone tools and shaping it with the broken saw blade until it fit the axe head socket, then wedging it tight with a hardwood shim driven in with a rock. The result was ugly. It was also functional. Suddenly she could fell trees instead of gathering deadfall. She could shape logs instead of using only what nature provided. She cut lodgepole pines, selecting straight ones roughly 6 inches in diameter that she could handle alone, limbing them with the axe and dragging them to the construction site. The front wall design took its final form in her mind as she worked. 2 parallel frames of horizontal logs 4 feet apart, with the space between them packed with fitted stones and mortared with clay from the creek mixed with sand for strength. The inner frame would support the roof beams. The outer frame would protect the stonework from weather. The mass between the frame, stone, and clay and earth would provide insulation and thermal storage that would outperform solid log walls by a significant margin. By December 8th, the wall frame was rising, and inside Emma Calloway's mind, the blueprint for the most important thing she would ever build had taken its final shape. The Kachelofen, the heart of the cabin, the thing that would determine whether she lived or died. And in 3 days, a man named Silas Comstock would arrive, examine everything she had done with the trained eye of a professional engineer, and tell her to her face that all of it was going to fail. He would give her 4 reasons. He would be wrong about everyone. Silas Comstock arrived on December 11th, 1883, riding a gray gelding that looked as tired and skeptical as its owner. He was 42 years old, a former engineer with the Union Army Corps of Engineers, who had spent the war building bridges, fortifications, and field hospitals in Virginia and Tennessee. He had been good at it. He had also been responsible for a timber-reinforced earthwork outside Petersburg that collapsed during an artillery barrage in the spring of 1865, killing 7 soldiers who were sheltering inside a structure that Silas Comstock had designed and certified as sound. He carried those 7 men with him the way Gunnar Harstead carried his 3 frozen neighbors. Not as memory exactly, but as principle. The lesson Silas drew from Petersburg was that engineering was not about cleverness or innovation. Engineering was about consequences. You built according to established standards because established standards had been tested by time and failure and the accumulated weight of other people's mistakes. You did not experiment when lives were at stake. You did not try new things when the penalty for getting it wrong was someone dying inside something you built. So when he rode up to a half-finished cabin in a hillside alcove and saw a 16-year-old girl building something he had never seen in any engineering manual field guide or construction reference he had encountered in 20 years of professional practice, his first reaction was not contempt. It was fear. He dismounted, tied his horse, and spent 15 minutes walking the site in silence. He examined the foundation, which was solid. He tested the wall frames, which were properly braced. He studied the alcove, the earth walls, the way the front wall was being packed with stone and clay between the log frames. He looked at the massive stone structure taking shape in the back corner of the cabin, the thing that was obviously meant to be some kind of chimney, but was 4 times wider and deeper than any chimney he had ever seen. Then he started listing problems. First, the chimney structure would collapse under its own weight. She had no independent footing beneath it, and clay mortar would not survive the expansion and contraction of repeated heating and cooling cycles. The joints would crack, the mortar would crumble, and several hundred pounds of stone would come down on her while she slept. Second, the firebox was built from sandstone. Sandstone could not withstand thermal shock. Direct flame at 600 degrees or more against stone that was designed by geology to sit at the bottom of a river would cause fracturing within weeks, possibly days. She needed fire brick, which was manufactured specifically to withstand extreme heat, and she did not have any. Third, there was no indication she understood how to calculate draft. The relationship between firebox opening area, flue cross-section area, and chimney height was the fundamental equation of any chimney system. Get it wrong and smoke would either pour back into the room and suffocate the occupant, or the fire would die from insufficient air supply. Her serpentine channels added massive amounts of resistance to the system. Without precise calibration of draft, the system was more likely to kill her than heat her. Fourth, she was building into a hillside. Come spring, every drop of snowmelt from the slope above would run downhill directly into and through her cabin. She would wake up in April, lying in a stream. He delivered these 4 points with the methodical precision of a man filing an engineering report. When he finished, he waited for the response he expected. Confusion, discouragement, the dawning realization that she was in over her head and needed to abandon this project before it killed her. Emma kept working while he talked. She was fitting a stone into the third course of the serpentine channel, pressing it into the clay mortar, checking the angle, adjusting, pressing again. When Silas finished his assessment, she set the stone down carefully, stood up, and addressed each point in order. "The chimney has a foundation," she said. "You are standing on it. I dug down 3 feet to bedrock and built up from there. Solid stone on solid rock. It is not going anywhere." Silas looked down. He had assumed the chimney sat on the same packed earth as the rest of the floor. He had not checked. He checked now, scuffing the dirt with his boot to reveal the dressed stone surface beneath. She was right. The chimney footing was independent, 3 feet deep, founded on bedrock. "The firebox stones will crack," Emma continued. "I know that. Sandstone is not fire brick, and I do not have fire brick. But sandstone will hold for 1 winter if I manage the fire carefully, if I build heat gradually, instead of shocking the stone with a roaring blaze, and if I accept that some cracking is inevitable and plan to replace the damaged stones next summer. This does not need to last a decade. It needs to last until April." Draft. The firebox opening is 2 square feet. The chimney exit is 1 square foot. The vertical rise from firebox floor to chimney cap is 15 feet. Even with the serpentine channels adding resistance to the system, the 2-to-1 ratio of inlet to outlet and 15 feet of stack height will generate enough differential pressure to maintain airflow through the channels and pull smoke cleanly. If the draft is insufficient, I add height to the stack. Every 18 inches of additional chimney height increases the draw. And the hillside drainage. She turned and pointed to the base of the back wall where a narrow trench had been dug along the entire perimeter of the alcove and lined with overlapping flat stones. French drain runs along the back wall and both sides angled downhill toward the east. Snowmelt hits the slope, runs down to the drain, follows the drain around the cabin, exits below grade on the downhill side. Water goes around. not through. Silas walked the site again. He checked the chimney footing, 3 feet deep bedrock exactly as she described. He checked the drain following its course from the back wall around both sides to the exit point. Crude stonework, but correct grade, correct overlap, correct principle. He examined the wall construction more closely, the double frame with packed stone between, and recognized that the thermal mass created by that design would outperform his own solid log walls in every meaningful metric. He did not want to admit any of this. Admitting it would mean acknowledging that a 16-year-old girl with no training had thought through problems. He had not considered solve them with materials he would have dismissed and produced a design that was in several respects superior to anything he had built himself. Even if all that works, he said, and his voice had dropped half a register, the unconscious modulation of a man whose confidence was being reorganized against his will, you are talking about heating this space with 1 burn a day. You understand how much wood that requires. You understand how long it takes that mass to heat up. You are going to freeze waiting for the stone to warm. Mr. Comstock? Emma's voice was steady, not defiant, not aggressive. The voice of someone who has done the math and is prepared to show their work. I appreciate your concern. I truly do, but I have been freezing for a month now. I know exactly what cold feels like. And I know this. Otto Brightman heated an entire house in Milwaukee on 2 fires a day, morning and evening. This cabin is 90 square feet. That chimney mass is proportioned to the room size. A single fire burning hard for 3 to 4 hours will transfer enough heat into the masonry to keep it radiating for 18 to 20 hours. I fire it in the morning. Let it burn while I work outside. Close the damper when the coals die. And the stone does the rest. Temperature outside might be 0. In here, it will hold 50 degrees all night. That is the difference between sleeping and dying. Silas Comstock wanted to argue. He was a man who argued the way other men breathe reflexively, continuously as a fundamental function of being alive. But something in her voice stopped him. Something in the specificity of her numbers, the precision of her reasoning, the complete absence of wishful thinking or optimism, or any of the other qualities he associated with people who built things that fell down. This was not hope talking. This was mathematics. She had worked it out in her head during those long, shivering nights in the cut bank when she had nothing to do but count and calculate and think about thermal mass and heat capacity and the rate at which energy transferred from hot stone to cold air. She knew the numbers. She knew the ratios. She knew the physics the way someone knows physics who has learned it not from a textbook, but from the desperate need to stay alive. You have about a week before serious weather, Silas said finally. After that, you cannot work outside. Better have the roof on and the chimney finished. I will. Silas rode away thinking he would probably have to dig another grave in the spring. He was wrong about that, the way he was wrong about the 4 things he listed. But it would take until February for him to understand just how wrong he was. Emma built the chimney the way you build a heart, with precision and patience and the understanding that nothing else works if this does not work. The firebox first. Floor level back corner. The flattest, most uniform sandstone she could find, pieces she had been setting aside for weeks, selected and sorted by size and shape and density, mortared tight with creek clay, mixed with sand for strength and resistance to cracking. The opening was 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, proportioned to accept substantial pieces of firewood while concentrating the heat into a focused area. Behind the firebox, 4 inches of solid stone and mortar separating the fire from the earth wall of the alcove. Below everything, 3 feet of foundation on bedrock. Then the channels. The first flue rose from the top rear of the firebox, climbing vertically about 2 feet before turning 90 degrees to run horizontally along the back wall. Built like a stone tunnel, roughly 8 inches wide and 8 inches tall, each piece selected for fit, mortared on all contact surfaces. The smoke would enter this channel at 600 degrees or more and begin transferring its heat immediately. At the corner where the back wall met the side wall, the channel turned again, running horizontally along the sidewall toward the front of the cabin, 6 more feet of stone contact. The smoke was cooling with every foot of travel, surrendering its thermal energy into the masonry the way a river deposits sediment gradually and continuously. At the front corner, one final turn. The channel rose vertically into the chimney stack, which exited through a gap in the roof. Total travel from firebox to chimney exit approximately 15 feet. 15 feet of stone through which every bit of heat from every fire would be extracted and stored before the cooled smoke finally reached the sky. The damper was a flat stone carefully shaped to slide into a groove cut into the channel at the junction of the horizontal run and the vertical stack. Open during burning, closed after the fire died, sealing the system, trapping the heat. The whole structure occupied a quarter of the cabin interior, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep. It looked like a mistake. It looked like someone had built an interior wall in the wrong place and then kept building it wider and deeper for no apparent reason. It was, in fact, the most sophisticated heating system in the valley, designed by an old German's obsession and built by a young girl's memory and validated by the laws of thermodynamics that neither of them could have written down, but both of them understood. The roof went on December 14th. Straight lodgepole logs laid across the wall frames, then stripped with bark, then 8 inches of packed earth on top for insulation and waterproofing. The weight was enormous but distributed across the 3 earth walls and the 4-foot front wall. On December 15th, temperature 12 degrees snow, falling steady, Emma built her first fire in the Kachelofen. It smoked, not fatally, not the carbon monoxide backdraft that fills a room and kills in minutes, but enough to sting her eyes and make her cough and tell her that the draft was wrong. The channels were creating too much resistance. She let the fire die, climbed onto the roof in falling snow, and used stones and mortar to add 18 inches to the chimney stack height. More height meant more differential pressure, more pull, more draw. She climbed down and tried again. This time the smoke pulled clean, drawn through the channels and up the stack with a sound like wind in a hollow tree, a low breathing sound, the sound of a system working. She fed the fire for 3 hours. Dry lodgepole split thin, burning hot and fast because she wanted maximum heat transfer into the stone, not a slow burn that warmed the air instead of the masonry. The firebox stones radiated first, heat you could feel from 6 feet away. Then the channel stones warming in sequence as the hot smoke passed through section by section the way sunrise moves across a landscape. By noon, the entire structure was warm to the touch. By sunset, it was radiating heat that pushed the cabin temperature to 48 degrees, while outside it was dropping toward 0. She banked the coals, closed the damper, stuffed moss into wall gaps, hung the blanket across the door, lay down on the sleeping platform. At midnight, she woke and reached out and touched the chimney stones. Warm, 90 degrees, heat soaking into her hand through her wrist into bones that had been cold for 31 consecutive days. Near dawn, she woke again, cooler but still warm enough that her breath did not fog. The cabin had held around 38 degrees all night, no fire. Outside, it had dropped to 6 below 0. 1 fire, 3 hours. Kept the cabin above freezing all night in sub-zero cold. A fraction of the wood a conventional fireplace would have consumed. The Kachelofen worked. Ruth Pemberton came on December 19th, a widow of 34 running her dead husband's homestead with 2 young children and a conventional fireplace that ate wood like it was starving and gave back nothing. She had nearly lost her youngest to hypothermia the previous winter and had spent 3 months sleeping in 2-hour fragments to keep the fire alive. "Show me how it works," she said. Emma showed her. Ruth touched the warm stone, felt the steady, even heat radiating from the masonry mass, and understood that she was touching the possibility of sleeping through the night. She left food. Potatoes, salt pork, half a loaf of bread. "Payment in advance," she said. "Spring, you help me rebuild." On December 22nd, Leland Crandall arrived on horseback. Good wool coat, new leather boots, a rolled map case that marked him as a man who dealt in paper and authority rather than stone and survival. He was 45 years old, a land agent for the Northern Pacific Railroad, one of the men responsible for securing and enforcing the millions of acres of land grants the federal government had awarded the railroad along its route. He looked at the cabin, looked at the girl, and informed her that the land she had built on sat within a section granted to the Northern Pacific Railroad by act of Congress. She had no homestead filing. She was not of legal age to file. The section was not open for homestead claim. She had until spring to vacate. Emma looked at this man in his good coat, in his authority, in his map case, and thought about all the people who had told her she had no right to what she was doing. Her father, who said she had no right to read. The men who said Otto had no right to be heard. And now this man saying she had no right to stay. "Mr. Crandall," she said, "I do not have papers. I have walls and a roof and a chimney that held 42 degrees in 6 below 0. Come spring, we can talk about papers. Right now, I need to survive the winter." Crandall was not cruel. He believed in order and law and the proposition that civilization required clear title and proper procedure. He also had eyes, and his eyes told him this girl had done something remarkable, and his conscience, which was quieter than his sense of duty, but not entirely silent, told him that enforcement in December was functionally identical to murder. Spring, he said, we will revisit this in spring. 5 days later, Nathaniel Greer arrived, a Northern Pacific surveyor, 47, a field man, who understood the difference between what maps said and what the ground actually looked like. He examined the cabin with professional admiration and identified a problem that would have killed Emma in the first serious blizzard. Backdraft. When high winds poured down the valley, they would not go around the chimney stack. They would go down it, forcing smoke back into a sealed earth shelter with no windows. Suffocation. Emma had worried about this, had no solution. Nathaniel proposed one, a wind cap built from stone, a square collar around the chimney top with openings on all four sides topped by a flat capstone. Wind from any direction hits the collar and deflects. Smoke exits through the leeward openings, direct downward pressure on the flue eliminated. They built it together over 2 days, the first time Emma had constructed anything with another person instead of alone. She noticed the difference, not just speed, though it was faster, quality. Nathaniel knew wind dynamics. She knew stone. The cap added 30 inches of height and a deflection system that turned the chimney from a vulnerability into something that could handle the worst the valley threw at it. Before he left, Nathaniel said something about the land situation. Crandall will be back in spring. If you want to keep this place, you will need the valley behind you, not beside you, behind you. Emma noted this, filed it away, the way she filed everything. On December 23rd, Gunnar brought Christmas. A sack of cornmeal, some beans, a handful of hardtack. "Merry Christmas," he said in a tone that made it clear this was the entire ceremony. He left. On Christmas Eve, Emma ate hot cornmeal mush alone beside warm stone, touched the blue ribbon on her wrist, thought about her youngest sister, checked the damper, and went to sleep. Tomorrow there was work. December 29th. Wind cap finished. Cabin complete. Walls sealed, roof solid, chimney drawing clean, thermal mass charged and radiating. Wood stacked. Food hanging from roof poles. Emma stood outside in the failing light and looked at what she had built. Earth shelter, stone walls, masonry chimney. Crude and ugly and absolutely functional. For the first time since November 14th, she thought the word home instead of the word shelter. There is a difference between those two words that has nothing to do with construction quality and everything to do with belonging. But Montana was not finished. On January 2nd, 1884, the worst blizzard in a decade descended on the valley with winds that bent trees and snow that buried the world. Temperature -31 degrees. 7 miles south, the Pritchard family, a young couple with 2 small children, fed their conventional fireplace and watched their woodpile disappear and did not understand why their cabin would not stay warm. They would burn through 2 weeks of wood in 3 days. They would not see the fourth. The blizzard hit on January 2nd, 1884, and for 72 hours, the world outside Emma Calloway's cabin ceased to exist. Wind came down the valley like something with weight and intention, slamming the hillside, shearing across the earth, roof piling snow against the front wall, until the door opening was buried under 3 feet of compacted white that might as well have been concrete. The temperature dropped through the 20s below zero and kept falling, 22, 26, 31 each degree, a tightening of the cold's grip on the valley until the air itself seemed to crystallize, and the sound of wind was the only sound there was. Inside in the dark, Emma sat with her back against the kachelofen and felt the stones pressing warmth into her spine through 2 layers of clothing. She had fired the chimney that morning, 4 hours of steady burning with dry lodgepole, while she could still see, and the thermal mass had absorbed that heat the way a sponge absorbs water, pulling it in, holding it, preparing to release it slowly over the next 18 hours, while the fire was dead and the blizzard raged, and the girl who built the system sat in darkness and waited. The cabin held 42 degrees. Outside, it was 31 below zero, a differential of 73 degrees maintained by nothing except stone and clay in the 15 feet of serpentine channel that forced hot smoke to surrender its energy before it reached the sky. She rationed everything. Water came from snow, collected before the storm sealed. The door melted in a clay pot propped against the warm chimney stones. The pot itself, a piece of crudely fired creek clay that she had shaped during a slow afternoon in late November and baked in the firebox until it hardened enough to hold liquid without dissolving. It was not a good pot. It leaked at one seam and the handle was lopsided and it would have made a potter weep. But it held water and it did not crack against the chimney heat, and that was sufficient. Food was dried elk meat and the last of Gunner's cornmeal, portioned by handfuls calculated against the days she estimated the storm would last based on the direction of the wind and the way the barometric pressure felt against her eardrums. A trick her mother had taught her that involved swallowing hard and noting whether the pressure in her inner ear increased or decreased. Higher pressure, meaning the storm was weakening; lower, meaning it had further to go. The pressure was still dropping on the first day. She rationed for 5 days, which meant portions small enough to keep her conscious, but not enough to keep her warm without the chimney. She fired the kachalufin once every 20 hours, burning just enough dry lodgepole to recharge the thermal mass to its operating temperature, and the cabin temperatures cycled between 38 and 52 degrees in a slow, predictable rhythm that she could almost set a clock by. At the bottom of the cycle, 38 degrees, she could see her breath if she held a candle near her face. At the top, 52, she could sit comfortably against the stones in her blanket and almost forget that outside the walls, the world was trying to end itself. The wind cap held. Every gust that poured down the valley hit the stone collar and deflected sideways. Smoke drew clean. Without that cap, carbon monoxide would have filled the sealed cabin in the first hour. On the second night in the howling dark, Emma discovered something unexpected. She was not afraid. Not brave, which is performance. Not courageous, which implies the presence of fear overcome. She was simply and completely unafraid. The fear had been spent. She had used all of it in the first days in the cut bank at 9 degrees, in the bleeding hands striking rocks for sparks in the swollen knee, and the gray sky in the question of whether she was fooling herself. There was none left. She sat against warm stone in a cabin she had built with her own hands in a country that was trying to kill her, and the 73-degree differential between inside and outside was proof that she had gotten it right. She had bet her life on creekstone and an old German's obsession and the mathematics she worked out while shivering in the dark. The bet was paying. She touched the blue Ursibin, thought about her sister for one moment, then said out loud to no one tomorrow, just the word, and went to sleep against warm stone while the world raged. The third day the wind stopped. The silence had physical weight pressing against her ears after 72 hours of continuous roar. She dug out through the door with a flat board, an hour of pushing and scraping until she broke through into sunlight so bright on fresh snow, it blinded her, and air so cold it burned the inside of her lungs. The valley was transformed. Drifts 10 feet high, creek frozen solid, trees bent and cracked under snow, and her cabin earth sheltered and stone-walled chimney standing straight with the wind cap intact had held against everything the mountains had. Gunnar Harstead showed up the next morning, found Emma outside splitting wood, her face chapped red from cold but her eyes clear and her axe stroke steady. He sat on his mule and watched her for a moment. "You made it," he said, something new in his voice. 3 years of arriving too late to save people had taught Gunnar to expect the worst every winter. Finding this girl alive, this girl he had given perhaps one chance in 3, rearranged something in him. Then his voice changed register, dropped lower, the way voices do when they carry weight that the speaker wishes they did not have to deliver. The Pritchards did not make it. Found them yesterday, frozen in their cabin, ran out of wood on day 2. Emma set the axe head down on the chopping block, stood still. The Pritchards, young couple, early 30s, 2 small children. They had come into the valley the same season as Emma, part of the same wave of homesteaders following the Northern Pacific Railroad west. Emma had never met them, though Gunnar had, and the way he talked about them now in short, flat sentences that refused to carry more emotion than they absolutely had to told her everything about how the finding had gone. The husband was at the table, still sitting upright, frozen in that position with his hands on the surface in front of him. He had been trying to start a fire with the last scraps of bark stripped from the cabin's own interior log walls when the cold took him. His wife was in the bed with both children pulled against her chest, the girl 4 years old and the boy 2, all 3 of them under every blanket and piece of clothing in the cabin, and none of it had been enough. The children were small. Small bodies lose heat faster than large ones because the ratio of surface area to mass is higher, and a 2-year-old in 31 below zero with no heat source is a candle in a wind tunnel. The mother would have felt them go still against her one, and then the other, and there was nothing she could do because there was no wood and no heat. And the walls of the cabin were not walls anymore. They were just pieces of wood standing between her and the same temperature that was already inside. They had built a standard log cabin with a standard stone fireplace, the kind that every settler in Montana Territory built because it was the only kind anyone knew how to build. Good logs, well chinked, a solid roof. The kind of cabin that looked right and felt safe and would have been perfectly adequate in Pennsylvania or Ohio or anywhere that winter was an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. They had stacked 2 weeks of firewood against the wall and believed the way everyone believed that 2 weeks of wood was enough to ride out any storm the territory could produce. During the blizzard, they burned their wood the way every settler burned wood in every cabin with a conventional fireplace. Constantly, desperately, feeding the fire every hour because the cabin would not stay warm no matter how much fuel they added. They burned it faster as the temperature dropped. Bigger fires, more wood. The primal human response to cold, which is to make a bigger fire, and the bigger fire consumed more wood, and the additional heat went the same place. All the heat went up the chimney and into the sky. 80%. That was the number. 80% of every piece of wood the Pritchards burned sent its heat straight up the chimney and into the Montana atmosphere. They were not heating their home. They were heating the sky. They were taking wood that had taken 20 or 30 or 50 years to grow, splitting it, burning it, and sending its stored energy up a stone pipe into infinite cold space where it dissipated in seconds and did no one any good at all. It was as Otto Brightman had said to men who were not listening, stupid. It was also standard practice. 2 weeks of firewood lasted 3 days at that consumption rate. When the last piece burned to ash and the fire died, the temperature inside the cabin began its drop. And that drop was fast, brutally fast, because a log cabin with a standard fireplace had almost no thermal mass to speak of, nothing to hold heat once the active source was removed. Log walls stored minimal energy. The stone fireplace radiated for perhaps an hour after the fire died, maybe two, and then it was cold stone in a cold room in a cold world, and the temperature inside equalized with the temperature outside. 31 below zero. The children died first, then the mother, then the father. 4 people, dead in a standard cabin built to standard specifications using the standard heating method that every other homesteader in the territory relied on. Dead because the standard method was, and always had been, catastrophically wasteful of the one resource that separated the living from the frozen. 7 miles north, Amala Calloway had used approximately 1/4 of the wood the Pritchards burned. Her cabin never dropped below 38 degrees. She slept through the nights. She had fuel to spare. And the difference between her survival and their death was not luck, was not toughness, was not any of the qualities that frontier mythology liked to celebrate. The difference was a chimney design that retained 74% of the heat it generated instead of throwing 80% of it into the sky. The difference was that one person on the wagon train had listened to Otto Brightman while everyone else laughed. Emma stood in the brilliant silence after the storm and processed this information the way she processed everything thoroughly and without flinching. She did not cry for the Pritchards, though she would think about them for the rest of her life, would see the image Gunner's careful, flat words had planted in her mind. The husband at the table, the mother with 2 still children against her chest every time she looked at a conventional fireplace for the next 60 years. She thought about what she knew and what the Pritchards had not known. The same information available to everyone on that wagon train, offered freely by Otto Brightman around a campfire to anyone who would listen. Rejected by every person who heard it except a girl sitting at the edge of the firelight in the place where daughters were expected to sit and be silent. "I am sorry," she said. Gunner nodded, looked at her cabin, the chimney, the wind cap, the girl. "I will be spreading word about this design. Folks need to know there is a better way." Emma put her hand against the stone wall, felt warmth even on the exterior surface, even after 3 days of the worst cold the territory had seen in a decade. "I used maybe 1/4 of the wood they did, and stayed warmer." He was right about all of it. She did not need to say who. Gunner knew. Everyone who had been on that wagon train knew the name of the crazy old German who would not shut up about chimneys. This was the moment the story of Emma Calloway changed from a survival story into something else. Up until the blizzard, she was a girl trying not to die. After the blizzard, after the Pritchards, she became something more. She had knowledge that saved lives. The Pritchards died because they lacked that knowledge. Other families would die the same way next winter and the winter after that if someone did not teach them what Otto had tried to teach and what Emma had proven with her own survival. From that day forward, she was not building for herself. She was building for the valley. January tested her differently, not with a single lethal blow, but with the grinding daily attrition of sustained cold and insufficient food. One meal a day of cornmeal mush stretched with hot water until it was more water than cornmeal, a thin gray gruel that provided just enough energy to keep her moving, but never enough to stop the constant low-grade hunger that lived in her stomach like a second heartbeat, always there, always reminding her that the margin between functioning and failing was measured in calories she did not have. Snare lines along the creek that produced 3 rabbits in 2 weeks lean. January rabbits with almost no fat on them, their meat stringy and tough, and barely worth the calories expended in checking the snares and resetting them in frozen ground. She ate everything, meat organs, marrow cracked from the bones with a rock and sucked out warm. Wasted nothing. Her mother had taught her that. When food is scarce, waste is a sin worse than any her father's God had ever conceived. Temperatures holding between 0 and 10 below most days, occasionally warming to single digits above 0, as if the cold were offering a mocking respite before settling back in. On those warmer days, she worked outside cutting wood, dragging it to the cabin, splitting it with the axe that Gunnar had given her, and that she kept sharp with a piece of sandstone she used as a whetstone. The axe had become an extension of her arm. She could split a 6-inch lodgepole into quarters in under a minute, feel the grain through the handle, know where the wood wanted to break before the blade hit. The work of keeping the system running consumed hours every day. Gathering wood, splitting it, stacking it inside to dry because green wood burned poorly and wet wood produced more smoke than heat. Clearing snow from the door opening every morning, sometimes twice a day, when the wind drifted it back. Climbing onto the roof to clear snow from the chimney cap, a dangerous job on an ice-covered earth roof with nothing to hold on to if her feet slipped. Checking the mortar joints for frost damage, which happened when moisture in the clay expanded as it froze and cracked the joints open, requiring patching with fresh mortar mixed indoors where it would not freeze before she could apply it. Maintaining the fire on a schedule, not too early and not too late because the thermal mass needed to be recharged at the right interval to maintain the temperature cycle she had established. Managing the damper, opening it before she lit the fire, and closing it after the last cold died because an open damper with no fire was a highway for cold air to pour down the chimney and suck the stored heat out of the masonry. Each task was small. Each task was necessary. The cumulative effort drained her body of energy it could not replace because there was not enough food coming in to cover the output she demanded from herself every day. She was running a deficit. She knew it. She could feel it in the way her muscles weakened week over week, in the way tasks that had been easy in December became difficult in January, in the way she had to rest between splitting logs, where before she could split 10 in a row without stopping. On January 12th, Ruth Pemberton appeared at Emma's door before dawn. The sky was still black, and the stars were still out, and the temperature was 9 below 0, and Ruth was standing in the snow, with her youngest on her hip and her oldest holding her free hand, and her face was the color of ash, and her hands were shaking, and she said one word, "Please." Her youngest child, a boy of 5 named Samuel, was burning with fever. 3 days running, Ruth's cabin, with its conventional fireplace burning continuously, was holding below 30 degrees because the wind had shifted to the north and was pouring straight down her chimney, and she could not keep the fire hot enough. And the boy was getting worse, and she did not know what to do. And she had walked 3 miles in the dark at 9 below 0 because the only warm place she knew of was a cabin built by a 16-year-old girl with a chimney that no one had believed would work. Emma brought them in, all 3 of them. For 4 days they lived together in 90 square feet of earth-sheltered cabin, while the Kachelofen held 45 degrees, steady and reliable, a temperature maintained not by constant feeding of a hungry fire, but by the slow, patient radiation of stone that had been heated once that morning and would stay warm until tomorrow. The boy's fever broke on the 2nd day. Whether it was the consistent warmth or the natural course of the illness, no one could say with certainty. But a child recovering from fever in a room that holds 45 degrees is not the same as a child fighting fever in a room that fluctuates between 25 and 35, depending on whether the wind is blowing down the chimney at any given moment. Temperature stability matters. The Kachelofen provided temperature stability. The conventional fireplace did not. Ruth slept. For the first time in 2 years, she slept more than 2 consecutive hours, lying against the warm chimney stones with her children on either side of her back pressed against masonry that held the steady heat of a fire that had died 8 hours ago. And the sleep was so deep and so complete that when she woke, she did not immediately remember where she was or why she was warm or how it was possible that she had not been woken in the night by a dying fire that needed feeding. She lay there for a long moment, disoriented by the novel sensation of having rested, and then she understood where she was and what the warmth meant, and something in her face changed. Not softened exactly, resolved, as if she had made a decision that had been waiting to be made for a long time and had finally found the evidence it needed. A 90-square-foot cabin built from creekstone by a 16-year-old girl had just done two things that no conventional cabin in the valley could do. It had brought a sick child through a fever by maintaining the stable temperature that recovery requires. And it had given an exhausted mother the first real rest she had known since the day her husband's horse threw him into a ravine, and she became the sole barrier between her children and the Montana winter. Not with medicine, not with intervention, with 45 degrees maintained by thermal mass when outside was 10 below zero. On January 18th, Ruth sent Caleb back alone. Her oldest, 12 years old, bright-eyed and curious with the particular kind of curiosity that does not merely want answers, but wants to understand how the answers work. He asked about the channels. He asked why stone held heat when wood did not. He asked whether you could build the same system larger for a bigger cabin or smaller for a single room. Emma drew diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick. She drew them the way Otto Brightman had drawn them in the dirt beside a campfire 4 months earlier for men who had laughed. She explained thermal mass and heat transfer and the relationship between surface area and radiation rate, and the reason why 15 feet of serpentine channel extracted more heat than a straight run of the same length. Caleb listened the way Emma had listened, with complete absorption, missing nothing. The circle closed. Otto drew for men who would not hear. Emma drew for a boy who heard every word. Knowledge does not die because it is ignored. It dies when no one passes it on. And in a dirt floor cabin in a Montana hillside, a 12-year-old boy was receiving the same knowledge that had been available to every adult on that wagon train and rejected by all of them. February arrived and brought the crisis Emma had not planned for. A warm spell in the first week, temperatures climbing above freezing for 3 consecutive days, melting the surface snow into slush and rivulets and small streams that ran down every slope and pooled in every depression and turned the valley floor into a landscape of mud and standing water that soaked through boots and clothing and made every outdoor task twice as difficult and 3 times as miserable. Then a hard freeze, sharp and sudden dropping from 35 degrees to 10 below in a single night, the kind of temperature reversal that Montana specialized in and that no one from the East ever believed until they experienced it. Everything that had melted refroze into a sheet of ice that locked the landscape under a glaze as hard and smooth as glass, an armor of frozen water that sealed the ground and everything on it and under it as effectively as if someone had poured concrete over the entire valley. The game disappeared. Rabbits went deep into their burrows and stayed there. Grouse vanished. The elk, which had been moving through the valley in small groups all winter, left entirely heading for lower elevations where the ice had not formed or had broken under their weight. The snare lines were useless because nothing was moving. The creek was frozen solid now, even the spring-fed pools that had stayed liquid through December and January, and the ice on its surface was thick enough to walk on without it creaking. Nothing could be foraged because every root, every dried berry, every scrap of anything edible was sealed under a surface that would not yield to anything less than an axe blow, and even the axe bounced off the ice as often as it broke through. Emma tried. She spent an entire morning chopping at the ice around the base of a rose hip bush she knew still had dried fruit on it, and at the end of 3 hours she had consumed more calories in the effort than the rose hips would have provided if she had gotten to them. Emma had defeated the coldest blizzard in a decade with engineering. She was being beaten by a warm spell, followed by an ice storm, the 1-2 combination that Montana winter saved for February, when they had already thrown their worst cold and wanted to try something different. She was too practical to appreciate the irony and too hungry to think about anything except the mathematics of starvation that she was now involuntarily computing every day. The mathematics were simple. A body at rest in a cold environment consumed roughly 2,000 calories per day just to maintain core temperature and basic function. A body doing the physical work Emma was doing, splitting wood, hauling it, maintaining the cabin, consumed closer to 3,000. She was taking in at best 500 calories a day from pine bark tea and the occasional scrap of dried meat she found buried in the cabin's crevices. That meant a daily deficit of at least 2,500 calories. Her body made up the difference by consuming itself first the remaining fat reserves, which were essentially gone by early February, then the muscle tissue converting protein into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis that kept the brain alive and the heart beating at the cost of slowly eating the body's own infrastructure. She could feel it happening, not as pain exactly, but as a progressive weakening that advanced a little further each day, like water rising in a cellar, quiet and steady, and impossible to stop without changing the fundamental equation of input versus output. By February 12th, the food was gone, completely gone. Not a scrap of cornmeal, not a strip of dried meat, not a handful of rose hips. She boiled pine bark and drank the liquid, which provided a vague sense of having consumed something without providing any measurable nutritional value. She chewed on strips of leather cut from the ruined edges of her shoes, softening them in hot water first, and then gnawing on them the way a dog gnaws on a bone, extracting nothing of value, but giving her jaw something to do, and her stomach something to feel that was not complete emptiness. She felt her body beginning to consume itself in earnest, the muscles in her arms and legs diminishing day by day, her hands losing the grip strength that she needed to swing the axe, her legs trembling on the walk to the woodpile that had once been routine. By February 15th, she was too weak to gather wood, could not drag herself to the woodpile 20 feet from the door, could not lift the axe, could not do the basic physical work that the Kachelufen required to function, because a passive heating system is not truly passive. It requires someone to gather fuel and build a fire and manage the damper. And if that someone cannot stand up, then the system stops and the heat begins to bleed away. Without fire, the thermal mass began its inevitable cool down, surrendering stored heat degree by degree into the cabin air and through the walls and roof into the infinite cold outside with nothing to replenish it. The temperature dropped through the 40s, through the 30s, and settled at 26 degrees overnight, still above the outside temperature, still proof that the masonry was working even in its decline, but not warm enough to keep a starving girl alive indefinitely. She wrapped herself in the blanket and leaned against the cooling stones and understood with the same cold clarity she had applied to every problem since November that she had survived the worst winter weather Montana could produce, and she had built a heating system that worked, and she had taught it to others, and she had done everything right, and she was going to die anyway, because the one thing she could not engineer was food appearing from a landscape sealed in ice. She touched the ribbon on her wrist. The blue was faded now, stained with clay and sweat, and the general grime of 3 months of hard survival, but the knot was tight, the same knot she had tied with her teeth in the dust of the Bozeman Trail on the day her world ended and began simultaneously. Silas Comstock pushed through the door, opening the next afternoon. He was carrying a haunch of elk over his right shoulder and a sack of dried beans in his left hand. He hung the meat from a roof pole without ceremony, set the beans on the sleeping platform. Then he stood there, this man who had listed 4 reasons her cabin would fail, and said 6 words. "You were right about the chimney." A pause. "I am adapting the design for my place. Figured you earned some payment for the engineering lesson." He left before she could respond, which was necessary, because if he had stayed another 10 seconds, she would have broken down completely, and she did not want to break in front of a man who had just walked 5 miles through frozen landscape, carrying elk meat because he had finally understood that this girl knew something he did not. But the meat and the admission were not the largest thing that happened in that moment. The largest thing was what it revealed about the valley's invisible infrastructure. Gunnar had told Silas that Emma was failing. Silas came. No one organized a meeting. No one circulated a petition. No one said out loud, "We need to save this girl." A man heard that a neighbor was in trouble and walked 5 miles with food. That was how community worked on the frontier. Not through institutions or committees or formal structures. Through action. Through showing up with what was needed when it was needed. Through the understanding, shared but never spoken, that in a place where winter killed and help was far away, the only safety net was each other. Emma cooked that night. ate slowly because her stomach had contracted to almost nothing, and eating too fast would have made her sick. Felt the protein and the fat entering her bloodstream like reinforcements arriving at a battle that had already been lost, turning the tide one cell at a time. She built a fire, charged the cockaloofin, felt the cabin warm around her. She was going to live. Spring came on March 4th, announced by temperatures that climbed above freezing and held there. The great thaw began. Snow melted, ice broke, water ran. Emma checked the French drain, working perfectly. Every drop of snowmelt from the hillside above hit the stone-lined trench and followed it around the cabin and exited on the downhill side. The floor was dry. The walls were dry. Silas Comstock's fourth objection that spring melt would turn the cabin into a creek bed was answered by a drainage system built by a girl who understood that water flows downhill and can be directed by anyone who bothers to provide it a path. Silas rode over to inspect the drain himself. He did not announce this was his purpose. He said he was passing through, but he dismounted and walked the trench and checked the grade and the overlap and the exit point. And when he was done, he stood for a moment and looked at it and nodded once and got back on his horse and left without saying a word about the drain or anything else. That nod was his review. It was sufficient. By mid-March, Emma was eating regularly again. Fresh rabbit from snares that were producing now that the animals had emerged from winter shelter. Wild onions in the sheltered spots where the snow melted first. Her strength was returning. Her mind was planning. In early April, Leland Crandall returned. Good coat, new boots, map case, the same legal authority he had carried in December, backed by the same act of Congress, representing the same railroad company that owned the same section of land on which Emma's cabin sat. He rode into the valley on a Tuesday morning with the unhurried pace of a man who knows the law is on his side and does not need to rush because the law does not expire. Miss Calloway, it is spring. We need to discuss this land. But this time Emma was not alone. Gunnar Harstead stood by the cabin door leaning on a fence post with his arms folded, his expression communicating nothing except the fact of his presence. He had ridden 7 miles that morning to be here starting before dawn because Nathaniel Greer had sent word through the valley's invisible network of riders and way stations that Crandall was coming and that anyone who cared about what Emma had built should be there when he arrived. Silas Comstock leaned against the front wall with his arms crossed, saying nothing. His face set in the expression of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to unmake it. He had ridden 5 miles. The same 5 miles he had ridden in February carrying elk meat for a girl he had told would fail. Ruth Pemberton was there with Caleb. She had walked 3 miles in mud and snowmelt, carrying her youngest on her hip because she had no one to leave him with, because walking 3 miles in mud with a child was a small price to pay for a chance at a future where her children did not freeze. Nathaniel Greer, who worked for the same Northern Pacific Railroad that employed Crandall, stood to one side with his hands in his pockets and a carefully neutral expression on his face that was not neutral at all, but was rather the expression of a man who has chosen his side and is managing the professional consequences of that choice in real time. 5 other homesteaders from up and down the valley, people Emma had never met face to face, but who had heard about the Cochaloofin and the Pritchards and the girl who survived, had ridden in that morning and tied their horses to the pines along the creek bank. They stood in a loose semicircle around the cabin with the unhurried purposefulness of people who had decided something and were not interested in having it debated. 9 people. No invitation sent. No coordination. No meeting called, no petition circulated, no leader appointed. Everyone knew Crandall would come because that was what Crandall said he would do, and everyone had independently arrived at the same conclusion and the same decision to be here when he did. That was how things worked in the valley. Not through organization, but through shared understanding. The understanding that Emma Calloway's cabin was not just a building, it was a proof of concept. And the concept it proved was that people could survive Montana winters without burning themselves out of house and home, and that meant the valley could sustain settlement, and that meant everyone's future depended on the knowledge that lived in the head of the girl standing in front of this cabin. Gunnar spoke first. His voice was not raised. Gunnar Harstead had never raised his voice in his life, as far as anyone knew. He did not need to. His voice had the weight of a man who had buried neighbors and dug graves in frozen ground, and who had watched a girl build something that might have saved the people he buried if he had known about it in time. This girl built something that saves lives on this creek, The Pritchards froze to death in a standard cabin with a standard fireplace. This cabin held 42 degrees and 31 below zero. You remove her, you remove the knowledge this valley needs to survive. Silas spoke next. He spoke in the precise, measured language of an engineer providing expert testimony because that was exactly what he was doing, and his words carried the weight of professional credentials that Crandall could not dismiss without dismissing the United States Army Corps of Engineers along with them. I inspected this construction. Foundation on bedrock. Thermal efficiency exceeding 70%. I built fortifications for the United States Army that were less sound than what this girl put up with a creekstone and no tools. This is not a squatter's shack. This is engineering. Nathaniel Greer spoke last, and what he said was calculated with precision to reach Leland Crandall, not through moral argument or emotional appeal, but through the one language that a railroad land agent understood, the language of company interest and revenue and the bottom line. Mr. Crandall, I work for the same company you do. I know which sections belong to whom, but I also know this. The company wants this valley settled because settled means occupied, and occupied means the depots have passengers and the freight cars have cargo, and the railroad earns revenue. This girl is not just occupying land. She is creating the reason for other people to stay. Every family that learns her chimney design is a family that survives the winter, which is a family that farms this valley in the spring, which is a family that ships grain and cattle on our trains come fall. Removing her is removing value from the line. And with respect, the company did not build 1,000 miles of track across the territory to remove value. Crandall looked around at the faces, 9 of them. Weathered wind burned hard-eyed quiet. These people had not come to argue or negotiate or plead. They had come to stand. There is a critical difference between those two things that every practical man recognizes: the difference between people who want something and people who have decided something, and Leland Crandall, whatever his limitations, was a practical man. He was not afraid of 9 homesteaders. He had the law behind him and the railroad behind the law and the United States Congress behind the railroad. He could enforce the eviction if he chose to, but he understood with the cold calculation of a man whose entire career was built on evaluating the costs and benefits of land use decisions that creating 9 enemies among the very settlers the railroad depended on for revenue was a transaction with costs that exceeded any possible benefit from reclaiming one section of marginal mountain land that the company would probably never develop anyway. I will recommend to the district office that this section be reclassified for homestead entry, he said. I make no promises, but I will make the recommendation. He left, rode out of the valley the same way he had ridden in, unhurried, because the law might have bent slightly, but it had not broken, and Leland Crandall was a man who bent with the law rather than against it. Emma stood among the people who had come. Gunner caught her eye and gave a nod, which from Gunner was approximately equivalent to a 20-minute speech from anyone else. Silas said nothing because Silas had already said the thing that mattered, and saying it once was enough. Ruth squeezed Emma's hand for 1 second and then let go. The homesteaders she had never met tipped their hats or nodded and got on their horses and rode away. Nobody made a speech. Nobody celebrated. They had come to do a thing, and they had done it, and now there was work. That was the frontier. That was always the frontier. Not the dramatic moments that stories remember, but the work that came before and after the daily undramatic labor of continuing to exist in a place that would kill you the moment you stopped paying attention. The section was reclassified by autumn exactly as Crandall had recommended. The bureaucratic machinery of the Northern Pacific Land Office, which moved with deliberate slowness in all matters except those involving immediate revenue, processed the reclassification with unusual speed, perhaps because Nathaniel Greer had written a supplemental memo to the district manager describing the valley's settlement density and agricultural potential in language that made the accountants in St. Paul take notice. Emma filed her homestead claim the following year when she reached legal filing age. The land became hers legally and permanently, 160 acres of Montana hillside that she had held through the worst winter in a decade and that the valley had held with her. What followed was building. Years of building. Not just structures, though, there were plenty of those, but something harder to quantify, and ultimately more important to the survival of the valley as a living community, rather than a scattering of isolated homesteads, each fighting winter alone. Fall of 1884. Emma cooked for a Northern Pacific rail crew, 30 men laying track through the lower valley. She fed them 3 meals a day from a cook tent near the worksite, earning $1 a day, plus keep, which was good money for the time and the territory. She saved every dollar, did not buy a single thing she did not absolutely need. She had plans for that money, and the plans involved tools. In the evenings after the crew had eaten and the pots were scrubbed, she sat by the cook fire and drew Kachalufen designs in the dirt for anyone who wanted to learn. She drew them the way Otto had drawn them, with a stick in earth, explaining the principles as she went. The firebox proportions, the channel routing, the mass to volume ratio, the damper placement, and the reason behind it. Most of the men listened politely, the way men listen to anything unusual, with half attention and no intention to act. But two of them listened the way Emma had listened to Otto, with the particular intensity of people who intend to build what they are seeing drawn in the dirt. They were homesteaders who worked the rail crew for winter wages and returned to their own claims in spring. By the following winter, both had constructed their own masonry heaters, adapted to their cabin sizes, and both reported fuel savings of 50% or better. Spring of 1885, she helped Ruth Pemberton rebuild. This was the first cabin Emma constructed for someone other than herself, and the process was different because she had to teach while she built, explaining every decision to Ruth and to Caleb so they could maintain and eventually repair the system on their own. The new cabin had a masonry heater proportioned to Ruth's larger living space, with a firebox built from stone that Emma had selected from a different creek outcrop that yielded harder, more heat-resistant rock than the sandstone of her original construction. The result cut Ruth's wood consumption by 60% and maintained comfortable temperatures through the entire winter of 1884 to 1885. Ruth slept through the night, every night, for the first time since her husband died. She told Emma in one of the few emotional statements Ruth Pemberton ever permitted herself to make that the masonry heater had given her back her life. Not merely kept her alive, but given her life back, because a woman who sleeps 8 hours is a fundamentally different person from a woman who sleeps 2, and the distance between those two women is the distance between enduring and actually living. Gunnar Harstead added a smaller version to his existing cabin that same spring, a retrofit that required partially dismantling one wall to accommodate the masonry structure. He told Emma it had changed his life, which from a man who considered 3 consecutive words, an extended conversation, was approximately equivalent to a public declaration of gratitude. By the end of 1885, there were 7 masonry heaters operating in the valley. People were coming from other settlements to learn the technique, riding 20 and 30 miles to look at Emma's cabin and ask questions and take notes and go back home and build their own. Emma was 17, lean and weathered and hard in ways that had nothing to do with unkindness and everything to do with the simple fact that she had been forged by conditions that would have killed most people. And she had come through them, not softened but refined, the way steel is refined by heat made stronger and more precise. She added 2 rooms to the cabin, built a proper door with hinges. She forged herself in a small smithy she set up with tools purchased from her railroad cooking wages, installed a root cellar that kept food year-round, acquired a milk cow chickens, a small garden plot in the clearing below the cabin where the southern exposure and the creek's moisture produced vegetables that had no business growing this far north, but grew anyway because Emma Calloway applied the same systematic intelligence to agriculture that she applied to everything else. In the summer of 1886, a young surveyor named Thomas Whitfield arrived in the valley on assignment from the territorial government. Montana was moving towards statehood, which it would achieve in 1889, and the territory was documenting its built environment, cataloging what worked and what did not in its particular climate. Whitfield spent 3 days at Emma's cabin measuring, calculating, interviewing, filling notebooks with sketches and numbers and observations. His report, preserved in the archives of the Montana Historical Society, is a document that reads like a professional engineer's assessment of something he did not expect to find and is not entirely certain how to classify. He called Emma's cabin a remarkable example of intuitive engineering, combining European thermal mass principles with frontier necessity and indigenous earth sheltering techniques. He noted that the builder had no formal training of any kind, had worked without plans or reference materials, and had produced a structure that outperformed every other residential building he had surveyed in the territory. His numbers were precise. The Kachalufen retained heat at 74% efficiency compared to 18% for the conventional fireplaces used in standard Montana cabins. Emma's total winter fuel consumption was 1/5 the valley average, while maintaining superior interior temperatures. At 20 degrees below zero, the cabin required approximately 11 pounds of wood per day. A comparable cabin with a standard fireplace required 45 to 60. A 4-to-1 advantage achieved with no manufactured materials, no specialized tools, and no knowledge that had not been freely available to every person on the 1883 wagon train. By 1894, 43 families in the valley were using masonry heater designs based on Emma's cabin. The winter death rate from cold-related causes had dropped from 12% to under 2% over 7 years. Otto Breitman's crazy idea, dismissed and laughed at by every grown man on the wagon train, had been heard by one 16-year-old girl sitting at the edge of the firelight, proved by her survival, spread by her teaching, and validated by the survival of everyone who learned from her. That is how knowledge works when it is allowed to work. One person listens, one person builds, one person teaches, and the circle expands outward like heat from a warm stone, not fast, not dramatic, but steady and relentless and ultimately undeniable. Emma married Thomas Whitfield in 1888. She married him not because she needed rescuing, not because she was lonely, not because Frontier Convention expected women to marry. She married him because he had spent 3 days studying her work with genuine respect and intellectual curiosity, because he asked her questions about her design decisions and listened to her answers the way she had listened to Otto's, and because he looked at her cabin and saw what it actually was, rather than what convention said a 16-year-old girl's work should be. They raised 4 children in the earth-sheltered cabin, eventually expanding it to 6 rooms while keeping the original Kasselofen as the heart of the heating system. The stone that Emma had fitted with frozen, bleeding 16-year-old hands warmed 4 children through their childhoods and kept warming long after those children had children of their own. The eldest daughter, Ada Whitfield Conroy, wrote in a 1943 memoir that she had grown up believing all houses were built into hillsides with massive stone chimneys, because that was the only kind of house she had ever known. It was not until she left Montana for college in the East that she realized her mother's childhood desperation had created something that most professional architects never achieved: a truly passive heating system that worked with nature instead of fighting it, a building that cooperated with its environment rather than trying to overpower it, a structure that understood at a fundamental level that you do not survive a Montana winter by burning more fuel. You survive by wasting less. The cabin stood until 1962. The National Forest Service acquired the property when Ada sold it in her 70s, and they documented the structure thoroughly before dismantling it for safety reasons. Their report noted that the original Kasselofen, 79 years old at that point, was still structurally sound and fully functional. The mortar had been repointed several times over the decades. The firebox stones had been replaced 3 times, exactly as Emma had planned from the beginning. But the channels, the damper groove, the foundation, the basic thermal mass structure that she had designed and built in 3 weeks of desperate November construction, all of that was original. 79 Montana winters, temperatures that dropped below 40, blizzards that buried the valley, freeze-thaw cycles that cracked concrete and split granite, and the stones held. Several of those stones are now in the Montana Historical Society Museum in Helena. They sit in a glass case on the 2nd floor labeled in neat museum typography. Early example of Kasselofen-style masonry heater, built 1883 by Emma Calloway Whitfield, age 16. They are ordinary-looking stones, flat gray, smoothed by the creek where she collected them. There is nothing remarkable about their appearance. The remarkable thing is what they did and who put them there and why. Modern masonry heater specialists who have studied Whitfield's report and the Forest Service documentation note several things about Emma's design. First, she got the thermal mass to room volume ratio almost exactly right. The chimney's mass was ideally proportioned to heat the small space efficiently, storing enough energy during a 3 to 4 hour burn to radiate for 18 to 20 hours. Second, her serpentine flue channels, while crude in construction, created the optimal balance between heat exchange surface area and draft resistance. The channels were long enough to extract maximum heat from the exhaust, but not so long or so convoluted that they choked the airflow. Third, her integration of earth sheltering with masonry heating created a synergistic effect that multiplied the effectiveness of both techniques. The earth walls moderated temperature swings, while the Kasselofen provided the active heat input. Together, they produced a thermal environment that was more stable and more efficient than either technique could achieve alone. They estimate that in terms of pure thermal efficiency per unit of fuel consumed, Emma's 1883 cabin outperformed most residential heating systems built in the following 100 years. Not because she had better materials or better tools, but because she had better principles. And she had better principles because she had listened to someone who was dismissed as crazy, and she had the intelligence to understand what she heard and the courage to better life on it. In 1924, a reporter from the Billings Gazette traveled to the valley to interview Emma about her early years on the frontier. She was 57 years old, still living in the valley, still sharp-eyed and direct, still running the homestead she had held since 1883 with the same systematic efficiency she had applied to building it. The reporter asked her how it felt to have survived what most people would consider impossible odds. Her answer was characteristic. She did not talk about feelings or fear, or the romantic notion of frontier survival that was popular in the magazines and dime novels of the era. She talked about problems. I did not think about odds, she said. I thought about problems and solutions. Needed shelter, found a hillside. Needed heat, remembered Otto's stove. Needed to survive, so I did the work. The frontier did not care about my feelings or my age or my gender. It only cared whether I could learn fast enough and work hard enough. Turns out I could. She lived until 1947, 80 years old. She died in the same valley where she had nearly frozen at 16, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and the community that existed in large part because she had taught them how to survive. The Kachelofen in the original cabin was still functioning on the day she died, still warming the rooms she had built, still radiating the same steady heat from the same creek stones she had placed there 64 years earlier. There is a tendency to romanticize frontier survival, to imagine it as simpler or nobler or purer than modern life. Anyone who has read the mortality statistics knows this is fantasy. The American frontier killed people in staggering numbers from cold disease, starvation, accident, violence, and the thousand small failures of preparation and knowledge that turned ordinary difficulties into lethal ones. The difference between the people who survived and the people who did not was rarely dramatic. It was rarely about strength or courage or any of the qualities that monument builders like to celebrate. The difference was usually small. One person who listened when everyone else laughed. One person who observed what others overlooked. One person who calculated instead of guessing. One person who had the stubbornness to trust their own thinking when every expert in the room told them they were wrong. Emma Calloway was thrown away by her own father at 16 years old, literally discarded in the Montana wilderness in November. She had nothing except a blanket and a ribbon and the contents of her own mind. Within 3 months, she had built something that changed how people survived in the territory. Not through luck, not through some innate frontier toughness that existed only in myth, through observation, intelligence, courage, and work. Those 4 qualities have not changed in the century and a half since Emma Calloway sat in the dust of the Bozeman Trail and decided to stand up. They are still the difference between giving up and figuring it out. They are still the qualities that matter when the received wisdom fails and the established methods prove inadequate, and someone somewhere has to look at the problem with fresh eyes and build something new. The technique Emma proved viable in 1883 masonry heating, combined with earth sheltering, eventually influenced building codes in several Western states. Modern passive house design incorporates many of the same principles she applied with creek stone and bare hands. Thermal mass, earth integration, radiant heating, minimal heat loss through the building envelope. Engineers have added insulation and precise calibration and monitoring systems and computer modeling. But the core concept remains what Emma figured out during 3 weeks of desperate November construction in a Montana hillside. You can work with natural systems to maintain livable temperatures using a fraction of the energy that conventional methods require. You do not have to fight the physics of heat transfer. You can cooperate with them. The frontier forced that kind of innovation because resources were scarce and mistakes were lethal. There was no margin for waste. There was no second chance if the design was wrong. You built it right or you died inside it, and the knowledge of which designs worked and which ones killed was paid for in the hardest currency there is. Sometimes the best ideas come from the intersection of necessity and intelligence. Sometimes they come from the people least expected to have them. Sometimes they come from an old German stonemason drawing in the dirt for an audience that will not listen, and a 16-year-old girl sitting at the edge of the firelight who will. Her chimney stayed warm through 20 below blizzards. 79 years later, the stone still held. That is not sentiment, that is engineering.